Welcome, everyone, to the Women's History Project's webinar series on writing women in history. I am a volunteer board member with the Women's History Project. Before we begin, I would first like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Although our speakers and many of you are located at very different places all across Turtle Island. We respectfully acknowledge the contributions First Peoples in Canada continue to make to our communities. And we appreciate that our journey to reconnect Canadians to missing parts of our history is a pathway we must ensure includes space for more Indigenous histories of these lands that we occupy. The Women's History Project came about because a group of women identified a need. Isn't that always the way things get done? We identified a need for our daughters and our granddaughters to see more of our women's experiences in the stories of our past. We do this through webinars, video podcasts, as well as live and online events. Today's webinar is part of a series to focus on the challenges of exploring and researching women's history. Barriers include the lack of materials or resources related to women, or the records written about or by women. Feminist politics and activists have been instrumental in revealing the gaps in history concerning women, often seeking to understand the historical roots of gender oppression and inequalities. As we have been told so many times, one of the benefits of history is its capacity to help us inform the present. But if you are absent from that history, what does that tell you about where we are and where we're going? Fortunately, we have an excellent group of women here with us who are doing something about this. And leading us in today's discussion is my fellow board member, Dr. Dawn Lavelle Harvard. Dawn is a proud member of the Wipmemegon First Nation, the first Aboriginal Trudeau Scholar. She has worked to advance the rights of Aboriginal women as the president of the Ontario Native Women's Association and president of the Native Women's Association of Canada. She is currently director for First Peoples House of Learning at Trent University. Dawn, welcome, and thank you for moderating today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I'm really excited to get going on this amazing topic tonight. We have some incredible, powerful speakers who have come to share with us their visions of the importance of creating space, of uncovering, of presenting and giving voice to women's history, to gender history, to those alternative perspectives, points of view that have been left out of history. So to give voice to that herstory, of course, that we're always looking for. So tonight, joining us, we have Dr. Rose Fine-Meyer, who's a senior lecturer at the Master of Teaching program at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Her work focuses on women, gender, and history education. She recently, in 2024, oh my gosh, I can't even believe recently, I can't believe it's already 2025. It's going so fast. And back in 2024, in history, Rose co-edited a book with Palgrave Macmillan entitled Women, Gender, and History Education. Rose is also president of the Ontario Heritage Fairs Association and is involved with several community groups, including the Ontario Women's History Network. I'm not sure what Ontario Heritage Fairs are, but it sounds really exciting, and I think that's something I could get into. We also have with us tonight Professor Adele Perry, who is the director for the Center of Human Rights Research at the Faculty of Arts, the University of Manitoba. She's a settler historian who grew up in British Columbia and has worked at the University of Manitoba since 2000. She works on histories of colonialism in Northwestern America in the 19th and 20th centuries and is committed to the transformative work of feminist and decolonizing scholarship. And tonight we also have a great friend of mine who is here joining us from Trent University. Professor Carleen Pendleton Jimenez is a professor at Trent University who specializes in education, gender, and social justice. She is also an award-winning author and filmmaker who wrote the animated film Tomboy and has recently had a short documentary released. She has a particular interest in investigating power, identities, bodies, and stories. with expertise in working with creative research methodologies. This is an absolute powerhouse of presenters that we have brought to you tonight to have a dialogue, to share all of our thoughts on at this incredibly important moment in history, the importance of women's perspectives, the importance of women's history and women's voices. And tonight we are doing our part, even if it's a small part that will be ever growing, our part in bringing those voices, giving a forum for women's voices to be heard. Ready to start? And hopefully, Rose was having some challenges with her camera. We're hoping that it might pop up at some point. But, really what we want to know, Rose, is your amazing, brilliant thoughts on this. So we will be satisfied and very happy, even if your camera does not come on. But we'll get Adele, if you can start with your opening thoughts.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that introduction, Dawn. I am coming to you not far from the Assiniboine River in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Innu, Anas Innu, Dakota Oyate peoples, and also the homeland of the Red River Métis. And we are governed here by the promises of the first of the number treaties, Treaty 1, and also by the Manitoba Act. And most of these promises, of course, remain unfulfilled. And these are some of the contexts within which I do the work that I do. And it's work that I kind of began in lots of ways in the last half of the 1980s, which is kind of terrifying and dates me in all sorts of ways. And that's where the moment where I first kind of came to questions of women's and gender history. And it was a particular moment where some of the biggest struggles for kind of a modest institutional presence, for space for women's history, in Canada, we're largely in the rearview mirror. I took a course on Canadian women's history with Veronica Strongbogue, and we had a textbook. It was this kind of small, light green book with a proud-looking settler woman on the cover, and it was the first edition of Rethinking Canada, The Promise of Women's History, published in 1986. Within a few more years, we were thinking more about gender history. For me, what was magic about women's and then gender history was its ability to transform how we see the past. And in doing so, kind of give flesh to our conviction that the present and the future can be different, more equitable, and more just. Finding women in history was a powerful starting point for a wider reckoning with the past and its relationship to the present. And for me, that was kind of personified when I began doctoral research in archival records looking for material about white women in migration in mid-19th century British Columbia. And it became clear to me how impossible it was to engage in those histories without meaningfully engaging with Indigenous histories. And this was something that my schooling as a public school kid in British Columbia and then as an undergraduate student in history had not prepared me for. But the records changed my mind, whether it was newspapers, correspondence, records of colonial governments. The archives taught me that renditions of history that siloed or invisibilized Indigenous lives were just wrong. And the development of a literature of Indigenous, Black, and racialized feminism, some of whom I read with Meg Lexton, who I see is on the call here at York University, writing in the 1990s. And the beginning of an international scholarship on whiteness also provided crucial tools. In the 3 decades or so since then, we've seen both enormous change and also kind of real persistence. Some of the change lies in a shift toward increasing numbers of women and non-conforming and non-binary folks in the profession of history. This remains partial, and it remains far from 50-50. And it also is not disconnected with the increasing institutional insecurity of historical scholarship and humanities scholarship as a whole. But there still has been important sorts of shifts. The transformative, I think, work of women's and gender history remains. And in the last couple of years, I've had the real pleasure of teaching a string of new kind of monograph-length studies from women's and gender histories. I think each of us show us in different ways how historians have been using the insights of feminist thinking to leverage new readings of the past. One was Alison Stevenson's remarkable 2020 book, Intimate Integration, A History of the 60s Scoop, which uses Indigenous feminist analysis on the removal of First Nations and Métis children from 20th century Saskatchewan to really create a new analysis of both family and kinship in the state. Another one have been books that I've encountered in my teaching of a third-year honors seminar with my colleague Jianming Kim on global feminisms. And there we have read Sarah Carter's very powerful book, Ours by Law of Right and Justice, Women in the Vote in the Prairie Provinces, a book that makes clear how taking the racial and colonial politics of first wave feminism seriously is both possible and necessary. We've also read Sarah Nichols' Assembling Unity, Indigenous Politics, Gender, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, which highlights the rich history of Indigenous women's political activism. And Amanda Ricci's book, Countercurrents, which I always want to call Cross Currents, but I'm learning to stop, Women's Movements in Post-War Montreal, which I think really shows us the possibility of a genuinely intersectional reading of Canadian gender history. And this is very much echoed, I think, by the crucial work that's being done by the Rise Up Feminist Archive, which makes clear that the presumptions of an exclusively kind of white and straight and middle-class second-wave feminist movements really need to change, and really shows us the range and depth of that activism in the Canadian context, and allows our students and ourselves the opportunity to work with those material. There is still, of course, a lot to be done, particularly at what is a very difficult political moment that I think we still don't have a clear grip on. The weaponization of trans and non-binary identities south of the border is being echoed here. Historians can play a role in showing that there always have been people who have lived outside of a gender binary or changed their gender's identity and presentation. Historians continue to play a role in documenting the costs when people are denied reproductive justice and bodily autonomy. We can and must do better at telling the stories of the struggle for reproductive justice that so profoundly shaped the 20th century. Women's and gender history have done many things, and one of the things that it can, and I think must continue to do, is to show us the real range that people over time and across space have continued and will live their gendered lives and their gendered selves. And it also can show us and reacquaint us with some of the many ways that we have found to fight. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just, that notion of living gendered lives, we all in one way or another live our lives within these intersectional spaces. So I'm now going to turn to Carleen, if you can share with us your brief opening thoughts and, what got you interested and focusing, what took you down this path with us?
Sure. Thanks, Don. And what a high compliment to know my work's being talked about in bathrooms. So it's like
literally in the bathroom.
Nothing better than that. So thank you for that. I know I was thinking about this, even listening to Adele, like, what's this path? And I would say that the path starts with my grandma. And, as a kid, she walked across the border, she lived in a time when, 1930s, they were doing millions of deportations. That's, and right back there. But anyway, but in particular, her, her constant storytelling, you know, she raised me with storytelling. And I mean, it was far away, but it was so, she was a good storyteller. And also, she's talking about the revolution, right? She left Mexico during the revolution. She acted out the cannonballs coming, which just as a kid seemed wild. But then, you watch, Gaza, you're like, oh, what happened to my grandma in those moments, you rethink things. I grew up on the story of the Spanish flu, okay, I don't know, she had a flu. And all of a sudden COVID hits, like, oh, I grew up on this story, So I would say first, my grandma, for some reason I listened. A lot of other people didn't listen to her, but I found it super fascinating. And I grew up in LA, and in a very, my family's Mexican and white, and I grew up in a very Mexican community in San Gabriel Valley. And yeah, it was that whole classic thing that there was never anything about Mexican Americans. There were no Mexican American authors. There was no Mexican American history. The only actually quote Mexican American history you got were the missions. So uh, deeply colonial curriculum teaching us how to build missions. Every child in California has to build a mission, and when you're a kid, things are unfair, that something's wrong, especially if you're a girl, and you're being told what you can and cannot do. And then you add this other piece of watching, people talk down to my mom, but not to me because I'm lighter skinned, the whole thing. Okay. Sorry, I don't want to give you the whole biography, but just to say that when I got to university and I started in Chicano studies, like for those of you that, if you might not know what that is, it's kind of lefty Mexican Americans that were like, we had a whole civil rights movement in line with the like Chicano. I mean, you're all historians, you probably do know all this. So, and at some point, well, first of all of a sudden, all this writing and history started coming, and I'm so starved for it. But then also to find out that it's right where I grew up, that's, it's not like I was learning about well, I mean, I was learning about other places, but, I think the piece that really profoundly influenced me is a piece of writing. I can get the title by Antonia Castañeda. And she researched, she's like a really foundational scholar in Chicano studies, and she researched what happened at the San Gabriel mission. And that was, 3 miles from where I grew up. We grew up around, that was our mission. And so not only, of course, you can read it, but of course, all those atrocities against indigenous peoples were there, Tongva people. But what also, I guess, fascinated me was how everybody knew those facts before Antonia wrote her piece, particularly the violence against women by the soldiers and the missionaries. There was constant violence against, sexual, physical violence against women. Everybody already had those facts. But I guess the question that kept going, but we don't understand why they kept resisting being missionized. Why did they keep resisting? All these, I guess, men had gone through asking that question. They couldn't figure out what's up with these people in San Gabriel that they don't want to be part of our mission, And Antonia's like, there's physical violence, sexual violence against women. That really upset people. Like it took kind of a woman to point it out. Like that's actually really upsetting. That upsets people. So they might not want to be part of your mission. Like she did in a profound way. And I guess at that point I kind of got like a, clue. I think that was a mid-90s that she wrote that. And I was like, oh, I get it. Okay. So there's all these facts, but unless you have these different perspectives, then like people can't even solve problems. They can't even figure out what it means because they don't know what to do with those facts unless you have a gender analysis in there as well. So, and, I could, I'm very influenced by a number of these women, Yvette Saavedra, Emma Perez, Alicia Gaspar de Alba, Dina Gonzalez, El Heinrich. There's a whole bunch of Chicana historians. They even have awards just for Chicana historians, every year. And so these are all my friends. These are all my colleagues. But the reason that they are, so I'll say another kind of piece for me is that in California, at the time, like when I was in my undergraduate at Berkeley in the early 90s, there were still not very many Chicana professors. And they had created a group called MOX. And NOX is Chicano Studies Association, National Association of Chicano Studies. But MOX was a summer institute, Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social, like women act in like letters and social change, I can say. But so we all went, and it wasn't a very expensive conference, and we sat down, we had breakfast, it was in the dorms, and this is the group. They said, listen, we need to make Chicana scholars. Like, we're just on a project, like one by one. We need to make a whole cohort, a whole, as many as we can, because right now our voices aren't going to be there. Our stories aren't going to be there. Those facts are not going to be read unless we kind of do a whole social project. So that's the group that I'm still a part of, like 30 years later, and you watch it build and build and build, so that now you look across ethnic studies programs, especially in the Southwest, but even on the East Coast too, and you'll see all these people coming out of what was first the Chicano, movement, the Chicano National Association, Chicano Studies, and also especially the women and especially the lesbians in that organization that said, no, 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 we have to have this intersectional lens. Like, this has to be part of it. And we were one of the first, like, ethnic organizations that had a lesbian caucus. I mean, now it's changed and more queer, but that particular women leadership made it a social project to make that change. Like, in terms of the thinking, in terms of the coming together every year, but in terms of creating that professoriate across especially the Southwest. So that's what's I don't know, that's what's made it possible for me, and that's why, even though I'm interdisciplinary, and I'm in education, I'm in English, but I find I'm deeply influenced by these women to create, like I do creative writing, like in writing novels that are now, it's funny, I always feel like historians are kind of more magical than I am, but I'm deeply influenced. And now I find that my novels will get categorized as historical fiction. I didn't realize the 80s was a history, I just apparently it is, but then it's like, oh, that's how the world is seeing these works, and clearly, and also the kind of documentation I'm doing and the leaps I'm doing come from Chicana feminists. Probably enough.
Okay. And thank you, Carlene, for introducing and reminding us the importance of that constant storytelling. Those stories that we were told as children, as we were growing up, listening to our mothers and grandmothers and our ancestors telling us their stories. And in our tradition, I remember that, very often my grandmother and great grandmother would tell you a story and then retell you the same story, and then retell you the same story. But looking back at it, realizing that every telling of it, they told you a little more. And sometimes it was a little more based on your ability. You've grown up a little bit, and every time you learned a little more. And so, now even within the institutions, right, how much of this is about the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves about other people, and the stories others tell us about themselves, and how all of those things intersect, and the importance, as you're saying, of that intersectional lens. I remember having one of my very first women's studies, as it was called in the day, classes, where trying to explain the difference of some of those perspectives, and finally kind of snapping and saying, like, I cannot get into your conversation about glass ceilings when women in my community don't even have roofs over their heads, much less ceilings. And so being able to really just people's minds kind of opening on that moment and realizing that, we are all in the same storm here, but not in the same boat going into that storm, and, just how important those stories are. So thank you for bringing that forward. And Rose, your opening comments. Will I see if I can find a light? It's getting dark here.
Okay, I'm sorry. First, I apologize again for why my U of T laptop won't show my image. I'm not sure why, but I do apologize for that. So excellent. What people have said here, Adele did such a wonderful job explaining all of the key, important scholars who played such a role that to her, and a lot of them are the same for me. And Carlene, the fact that you started with your mother and your grandmother is exactly how I was going to start. So I had a strong mother. She was a sick mother and didn't live very long, but she was a strong mother. And I had a very strong grandmother who lived with us. And and who was a refugee escaping, a long escape story to get to Canada, and grateful for that opportunity. But when I was a little girl, my mother said something to me every year. Okay, so I'm old enough that when, this is way before computers, and when you went to school every year, you got a form. And in that form, you filled out everything about your life. What your mother did, your father did, your religion, everything. It was all in there, and you had to fill it out. And I remember my mother saying, remember, don't put on the form that I work, because my mother worked. She had to work to have the full income that they wanted to have. My father worked, but my mother had to work. But that she would remind me every year not to put that on the form. And years later, I said to her, why did you not want me? Why did you want me to put housewife, home, whatever they called it back then, at home when you weren't? And until she became so ill that she actually was. But for a long time. And then she said, well, because that would be a shame for my father. Clearly, he's not doing his role of, supporting the family enough that she has to go to work. So that, I think that played a role in me every year, being reminded to not note that she goes out to work every day and the importance of her work, because she was very strong, and she was very smart and was able to have this really important job. And yet she was feeling the need to hide it in a very gendered world that made women need to not celebrate their strengths and their abilities. So certainly the concepts of equity are there at a very young age. So for me, getting into everything to do with history, I have a music degree and a history degree, and I've done both. But what I see when just quickly looking back at what I've done is that I'm always looking to work with strong women. I am always looking to work in women's projects. I mention later, if we are able to get to that point, that I worked with Pat Staten to create the first book about women's history specifically for schools, filled with documents and stories. And that didn't come out to 2004, which, if we get time, I can reflect on that history. But that was very exciting. And she came looking for me because I was already had this reputation of somebody who was creating courses, looking for materials. That happened to me in university. My master's degree, I was looking at immigration, obviously because of my family, looking at women in domestic service, again, because of my family. And then my whole PhD thesis is about recognizing women and scholars and historians and the public, and especially publishers, to ensure that women's stories and historical experiences are placed out there. So in university and then in all places that I can. But I will say that it became aware. I became aware early on that if you wanted to find women's stories, oh, Carleen, you are the loveliest person. She's holding up the book. Do you know that when I was doing my PhD and I was interviewing people, there was one person who came to be interviewed and said to me, by the way, do you know about this book? And then he pulled it out of a bag. And I said to him, read on the front who wrote that book. And then he went, oh my goodness, it's you. So that was, a moment for me. Thank you. That's so kind of you. I think if you want to find women's stories, and this is what publishers and scholars did in the past to bring out these stories, is they went local. Women have always been involved with their local communities, where they play a major role in terms of leadership. That was my mother. Activism. That was my mother. And where their abilities are allowed because there's local stories. So that was me. I was always involved with local projects, looking for those, women's stories, those missing stories. And that's why the involvement, I created a women's talk series called Her Stories Cafe. And for years, we had all kinds of women who came and shared their stories. And of course, the cafe part, we ate and drank. Being involved with the Heritage Fairs or the Ontario Women's History Network, these are all projects that I'm doing and looking forward to provide, those missing narratives. And also more recently, and I'll just end with that, is the opportunity to recreate lessons for students on all kinds of levels where they can revisit women's historical narratives with new additional insights. So that's a project we're working on called Framing Our Past 2.0.
Thank you, Rose. I was just thinking about that form and thinking that, I'm actually, it's kind of good that they didn't have those forms up in Wikwemikong when I was in elementary school to identify what your parents do or don't do, because my grandmother at the time ran the general store. She had the post office. She was responsible for the post office as part of that store. She organized all of the busing for the entire island of Manitoulin and drove one of the bus routes herself. So, you think about a woman who was working. There was certainly, she took a lot of pride in what she did, and especially in her ability to drive the bus. Although I must admit that she didn't like the vehicle that my father drove. She thought that her daughter deserved a safer vehicle. And so she backed over his truck with her school bus at one point to make sure he had to buy a new vehicle. And just to make sure, when she went out, she actually drove over it twice, just to make sure he couldn't drive away. That was her way of making sure that things were happening. But, this very notion that a woman's empowerment, that a woman's ability to with our community, women contributed just as much in as the men. What should be something that should be a moment of pride for all of our children and grandchildren, how that became seen not as a woman in herself, but as a reflection of a lack in the family. So really happy that, we're here tonight to talk about unpacking some of that, talk about the positioning of women's empowerment, the positioning of women's stories and women's identities. So while we're here to discuss gender history and the treatment and interest of women's stories and the more inclusive stories, the more inclusive histories that we have developed over time, incorporating all of those different perspectives and lenses and experiences, with that journey of development in mind, we want to look back at history, and I'm going to be asking our presenters to think about what has the historical space for discussion look like for women's history and gender history, and why is gender history important? So how did this study and practice become more front and center? Even for me, thinking about how it was originally, it was a women's studies course, but now we're talking more broadly, more inclusively about this being about studying gender, not just studying women. But here tonight, talking about what has this historical space for discussion look like for women's history and gender history? Why is this gendered history important? And we have these fantastic experts here tonight to share some of their perspectives on that. And I think, Adele, if we can pop back to you and give Rose a minute to rest her voice after all of these amazing introductions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I guess the basic question, why is gender history important? Because it explains our lives and the lives of those who have gone before us. And that in a crucial way is what the work of history does. I think the other thing that gender history can really do is remind us about the possibilities of living otherwise. We sometimes get kind of stuck in these moments where it seems like there's a very limited range of possibilities of how we might be human, how we might be kin, how we might be in relationship with the places where we live and the people that we live with. But I think history, when done right, really blows that up in pretty significant ways, because it shows us the really wide range of ways that people have lived. And it shows us the different kind of possibilities for being human. And I think that is enormously important work. It gives us that way of speaking back to forms, to go to Rose's example, or to speaking back to Carlene's sort of depiction of this sort of denial of presence and community in place. It kind of gives us ways of thinking differently and thinking otherwise. I don't think it provides easy answers, and that's why it's sometimes kind of tough. And I think we kind of have seen a moment where these arguments have been made for a while. It's fair to say these aren't blindingly new, but there's some limits. So whenever anybody produces a tedious list of the most important Canadians or whatever, or the most important historical figures, there is either no or very few women or non-binary folks on those lists. And I think that's a real kind of reminder of how hard it is to get those really conventional understandings of what counts as capital H history and what counts as an important figure in history, and how hard it is to get those to engage meaningfully with the lives of women and gender diverse people. And sometimes, sometimes the results to really kind of push in those directions can also kind of lead us in pretty kind of brittle directions. But I think at its best, what gender history does is help us understand our lives and the lives of those who've gone before us, and also helps us think about a different possible future.
Thank you, Adele. So now we're going to ask Rose, and then we'll circle back to Carleen. So we'll give you one more minute to, hey, Carleen is furiously writing new thoughts. I can see you. So Rose, if you want to jump in.
Well, Adele, again, did such a great, providing that, those foundational statements and definitions are so much appreciated. So I answer everything through an education lens, because that's, I tell my sons that when I pass, if there's a tombstone, I should just say school, or should just say education, because that's my whole life. I never left. So I'm still doing it on all levels. I've been an educator. So that's the lens I'm going to answer all my questions. So, for 100 years, there was no history that included women or gendered stories. It was just left out. I think that I'm not sure that everybody was thinking they were in a deliberate way that they were leaving out these stories, but certainly educators weren't aware. In my thesis, I did interview someone who started teaching in 1954, and I brought that up. And his comment was like, "Oh yeah, that would have been good, but I don't know, where would I have gotten the resources from?" I'm going to argue that actually continues, that the concept of including women or gendered stories, it becomes problematic in education, first because it wasn't there for 100 years, and then because it in the steps to bring it into the curriculum, they haven't done that fully well. And I mean everybody, except in the universities. And I guess you could argue that that's not happening there too. I mean, it's not that they didn't think that women existed. Certainly in most cases, women were more than half the population. I think it was just about power. I think this is always about legal power. It's about power. Because that's the whole person's case, was to be identified as a person. Certainly everybody's mother, they knew their mothers were persons. So this isn't about the right of being a person. The same thing, whether we're looking at gender or women. I think this has to do with power. So if we don't give them those rights, they can't have those powers over us. And certainly the curriculum was always, in history, was dominated by white political, industrial, military men. But I will say that the activism that took place, and, I remind my students all the time of the importance of public activism to push back, like their voices matter. They need to get out and do the things to challenge state narratives and state action. Because that's what happens in the 1970s and 80s in curriculum. I mean, as late as 1989, they did a study, an OISE study, that found only 12% of this is 89. So this starts, in the 60s and 70s. There's only 12% of the books that recognize women. And I can tell you there's nothing about gender in there. But even the recognizing women was things like Elizabeth Simcoe accompanied her husband to Canada. So it's as thin, pretty limited inclusion. Nothing about her, who, by the way, was brilliant with her drawings and her sketches and her stories that really give us some insight into that time period. But anyways, it's so really, we're not looking at a period until the 90s when things start to change, but only in small ways, and only because of these wonderful publishers like, Women's Press and all the work that Margie Wolf was doing, and Second Story Press. And they were doing massive work to take the scholarship from the universities and bring it women's studies and gender equity. both of those categories, that's what they were doing to bring it into the classroom. But then there's a lot of problems with that. And I give the example of Kathleen Wynne, who decided to write a course on gender equity in the province and ran into all kinds of problems and pushback from that. It even lost her the election. So I am a believer that publishers and scholars and educators have taken the lead in terms of what we are, how we're engaging with women's historical experiences, how we're engaging in gendered stories, that they continue to play this important role. I, want to say a shout out to Natasha Henry, who does so much on Black Canadian women, and all kinds of Indigenous women scholars like Hope Meek and Robin Kimmerer and, Kira Brandt and others that are doing the good work that allows women's historical experiences and gendered stories to have a space. But we've got a much more to do to make this a part of history curriculum in schools.
I'm really glad you brought up, when you mentioned the person's case and the famous five, or we actually just had a presentation on that here at Trent about a week ago. Nellie McClung, Emily Murphy, the famous two, and the other three that I can never remember. One of the things that we talked about, you were saying that history, how could we have those conversations about the voices that are not there? And so as part of this famous five conversation, we brought in the Indigenous famous six, those six Indigenous women activists. You're talking about the importance of public activism. And so, when we brought the famous five in, bringing in that alternative perspective, making sure that those voices were heard. And, there is a comment in the chat here about how the famous five statue from Calgary has been put into storage. And this really speaks to, we have to be careful about canceling things, that we have to, have complex understandings that, they're people, there's important things they did, there's awful things they did, and that we have to uncover and understand and know about the good and the bad as all of that history, so that we understand, that structuring of power in our history and how it impacts everybody differently throughout that history. So I really appreciate you bringing up the famous two and the other three that I can never remember. Maureen says her grandmother knew. Irene Parley, thank you. I appreciate the reminder. Now, if anybody else in the chat can remember the other two, I would be really grateful. And it'll be like a bonus point and a prize go out to somebody later if you can remember without looking up the Indigenous famous six, because I'll send you a copy of my latest book if you can look it up, if you can remember them without Googling. All right. So moving on to our next, this is a really exciting conversation. I'm actually getting a little bit breathless because I get too excited here about this. This is the best conversation I've had since the famous five conversation a couple of weeks ago. So having explored how this discipline and the academic area of gender history has been evolving, we want to dig into some of the challenges of trying to make history more inclusive of class, culture, race, but particularly gender, how we try to, bring out those women's stories. And I think our presenters have already touched on it a little bit, but what are some of the challenges that you have faced when trying to discover, collect, research women's history, research gendered histories, and bring those to the forefront, in a very practical ways throughout your research, throughout your work in this area? What have been those challenges that you've been facing? And we'll jump to Carleen. And any of your comments on the last question that I have completely jumped right over, start with those.
My note writing, though. But actually, if that other one was last,
you wrote it down.
I followed you too. I think I just need to keep following you around because good conversations. Well, yeah, I can kind of combine the answers on this. Yeah, just to add to what Adele and Rose were saying, I still find, even as somebody now in the position to review curriculum, like I have to do the little approval of syllabi, and I'm always very academic freedom oriented, and yet, they're still so white male syllabi, especially education. Yeah, but it's education, so got to have these theorists, and they got to, there's the ones that call themselves theorists, and like it's still very missing. I just want to add, we're saying, what does it do? What does a gender history do? I feel like sanity, it's helpful with sanity, you know, especially this week, but like it's going to be some rough time, and it's almost like you just need to like have some circle of reminders of what people do. I would say in my own project, kind of more in art space and creative writing, I often go back to the history of kitchen table press, in Boston. Shri Moraga was one of my mentors in California, and just this idea of like her and Audre Lorde and a couple of the other women, names are escaping me right now, hanging out and just like, yeah, we got to put our writing out there. We just got to do it. We'll just get together. We'll do it. Put together a press, and then this bridge called My Back becomes like, wins all these prizes. Sells, I don't know, 50, 100,000 copies. I don't know. I don't remember what the last count is. And I was just so captivated by that. So I think Adele, you were saying like to know how to live otherwise, and I just think I know that happened. And and there's no reason why we can't keep doing that, and they just did it, and there was nothing there for their classes, for them to even put in their classes, because I think back to what I read, they're like, we don't have anything in our classes even, so we have to publish it in books and get it out there. And that gives me a lot of motivation, yeah, like inspiration, yeah. And then even you go way back, like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in Mexico, like she wrote this feminist treatise like in the 1600s. She was having an affair with all the wives of the fancy guys. She was in the convent doing her work. And you're like, wow, she was just having this incredible life and writing all these feminist thoughts that, in the playground in the 1970s. I'm going, why can't I have the basketball court? But she was already, thinking those pieces. Another one I think that maybe bridges the questions is, I just thought of it. The other huge inspiration on me was Leslie Feinberg, who was a self-made historian in the U.S., trans historian, and that had a big influence on me. And Adele, when you're talking about like learning how to live otherwise and like showing us what you can do, and I thought, yeah, kitchen table. That's when I thought, that's kitchen table. It's still right there. And then I thought of Leslie Feinberg, what a huge influence. They were, she was, he was, they changed their name, was that like they weren't university educated. They just went into museums to find anything trans. Like there's like just this conviction. There's no way that I'm the first one. And would go into the museums and they would have those little, I don't know, when they describe what's happening in the artifact or in the picture, like, we go in, we're like, that really, is that what's happening? And Leslie would go and look, and it would be like, you'd see this carving of this, I don't know, this stone carving of this person hundreds and thousands of years ago or whatever. And it's like clearly looking like a trans person. And then you would see, like, they describe it in a chapter, almost their methodology of going into museums, looking at the piece, and then seeing the description would go, yeah, you're not really seeing a trans, I mean, they don't say that, but they're like, yeah, just, and Leslie just sitting there going, come on, there's no way, and talking to the museum person saying, hey, because I'm looking at that and they're doing the like quote women's work, but they have the men's body. What does that mean? And it's like, oh, well, yeah, we don't let the public know about that. We have to carefully label that something different. So when you talk about the challenges, like the challenges is we're already given kind of road markers that are gaslighting us. Like, and you have to figure out when they're gaslighting you and like somehow have enough confidence in yourself to not believe it and go on your hunch, and go a different path. Because it's not like, oh, we're just all discovering objects and let's see what we can make of them. It's like, no, these objects are already there, and these other meanings have been given to them, and you have to somehow step back and like, knock those meanings aside. So yeah, so when you're saying inspiration for what you do, but I was thinking just inspiration for like just being, like that was a huge piece. Like in when I was thinking of, a social justice claim for my own human rights, like as a butch kind of trans person, um, no, we've always been there. That was like a major piece that we have been there, even though we have to figure it out ourselves and there's all these roadblocks. Um, you know, uh, so that's both an example of the challenges and the kind of possibilities, and the kind of beauty when that happens. And even my children's book, that Pat State, I was so happy to hear her name. And anyway, that she believed in my book, and it was in that one page made all the difference. It was like, we have, there's always been the mom saying to the kid, there's always been boy, girls and girls, that's always been, so you're going to be all right, so anyway, that's a few ideas.
I mean, it's so important though, what you're saying about it's always been there. We've just been told that we weren't seeing what we were seeing. Like this notion of this historical gaslighting, and those who are the official interpreters of what we are seeing, literally gaslighting us and telling us that we're not seeing what we're seeing, and the literal construction of reality in those ways. And that's why what we're doing here, and what all of our feminist historians, all of these voices, is so important, is giving those reinterpretations of what we have been told that we were seeing, learning to look at things and interpret them in different ways, learning how to live otherwise. Like, I think it's really profound in terms of how that can literally change your life once you learn to see something differently, because then you can't unsee it. And that's absolutely critical. Adele, do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, I got lots of thoughts on that. No, it absolutely is. And you can't unsee it. Like, it's one of those, once you've heard the story, you've heard the story. And I do think there is something so powerful about the work that kind of history can do. And I say this as somebody who currently does a fair bit of kind of big, kind of collaborative sort of social justice research that very much kind of centers these kinds of analytics and objects. But then there's this other part of me that is very much a historian of the 18th and 19th centuries, with kind of a love-hate relationship with the colonial archive, and that I very much kind of enjoy working with it in a certain respect. I think motivated because I'm interested in a moment of time where these territories where I've lived all of my life were lived in a way that was different, and the relationalities were different. And before sort of settler colonialism had this kind of lock on possibilities of different ways of living in these territories. So for me, I go back to those times and moments because of that. But it also means working with a very particular colonial archive that has really limited space, and thinking about women, and thinking about kind of people who live beyond a gender binary in that archive often involves the kind of sort of recognition that Carleen has already sort of spoken about, that way of having faith in a certain kind of amount of possibility and pushing back against it. And I'm thinking here about kind of work that scholars like Saadia Hartman has done. And she makes this argument, which she calls the need for critical fabulation, and in particular writing about the lives of Black women and girls in the contexts of slavery. And there's different ways of going about it, but I think the knowledge that we existed, and the we here, varying different we's operating in this context, but kind of pushing back against an archive, which makes it appear that silence is logical and natural, but those silences are produced by the archive itself. But it is often not a huge amount of fun. The handwriting is terrible. The archive's hours are poor. I can enumerate the barriers to doing this kind of work. It tells you a lot about what a very small group of white men thought about the world. And you have to read between the lines to think about the other lives that are operating around those stories, and also the damage that they did and continue to do.
Yet I'm strangely intrigued by these archives. You mentioned this love-hate relationship because, I have this, intrigue that it's a space that because most of us mere mortals out here would never have access to. Like, I just can't imagine. I would love to get in there and see, even if it is a very particular perspective, it's one that the rest of us never get access to.
Well, and there's power to that, right? And that is a manufactured kind of sort of power. And in partially, it's the way that kind of the mystique of the archives, which historians can kind of trade on, perhaps too much. Not really, but there is a huge amount of work to be done with written archives, including written archives produced by Indigenous and racialized kind of communities, which I think sometimes have been a little bit sidelined and kind of presumptions that they don't exist. I live about a kilometer away from the Hudson's Bay Company Archives, which is a classic colonial archives, like out of a textbook, like you couldn't imagine one. But when you think about the extent to which the workforce of the Hudson's Bay Company in the 19th century was Indigenous, and the extent to which a lot of the records were produced by men, in particular working in the trade, it's a really interesting, archive produced by often by a range of people, but certainly including Indigenous folks who are working in the fur trade. And there's a lot to be kind of learned and sat with.
I'd kill to have access. Just the thought of the Hudson's Bay archive.
Come anytime.
It's just like, oh my God. I was gonna say, I'll trade you a pony if you want to sneak me in there.
I can. It can be done anytime, John. We'll do it.
Excellent. I'm coming. I'm gonna take you up on that. And Rose, your thoughts?
So, well, before I, actually attach to what Adele said about colonial archives, because that's how I answered that question too, was I do want to note that I see Linda Silver-Dranoff in the public here. And when I was talking about those iconic role-playing scholars, she was one because, I forget the date. It's in the 1970s, and she wrote about women in Canadian law. I would encourage you to read her book Fairly Equal, that is more current. So welcome, Linda, that I see you. I'm a big fan of everything that you've done. And the other thing that I want to mention is
Thank you, Rose. It
Yeah.
was 1977, and I remember you interviewing me because you saw it used in the schools, and it was written both for the general public and to be used in the schools. And it was a history of women in Canadian law, starting. My first chapter was called Perspective, and it started at the beginning of time. And then I got down to having to go to the archive, the microfiche, to the stacks, because there wasn't anything much written in terms of secondary sources. So thank you, Rose, for remembering that.
Thank you for being here. I also want to mention the book, Judith Butler's book that she put out last year, Who's Afraid of Gender. I want to really encourage everybody to read that. It's, addressing a lot of the issues that we're talking about now. And, she knows how to write about that, and also gives a warning about what's taking place now. And it's just written so beautifully. I would encourage that. So, jumping onto piggybacking onto colonial archives, I was answering this question that way with a few examples. So, since the past is not a place where we can go and history is crafted from what is left behind, we are tasked with finding primary sources. And as Adele noted, one of those challenges is, where is it? So finding those diverse genders, the stories about women, you're having a challenge finding them in traditional libraries or archives. You have to dig deeply to find that. But I'm going to give a few examples where there's hope, because I don't always like to be that, these things aren't there. We can find them, but we have to dig deeply and we have to demand it. So several years ago, I went to the Ontario Archives with my students because they're going to be history teachers. I want them to use primary sources in their classrooms. And the Ontario Archives has vast number of archival materials to use. But we did notice that there were not very many gendered stories. There wasn't any women's stories. I challenged the archives over that. And the head of education at the time, Michelle Foggett, she was wonderful. And she said, it's just that they're hidden. They aren't acknowledged in the catalog. So just like Adele was saying about the workers of the Hudson's Bay, maybe they are in there somewhere, but nobody's put them in the database, right? Nobody's acknowledged them. No one's categorized them. So that's what they did. They went looking for those stories. Now, maybe they aren't there. Maybe they were deliberately, we go back to the issue of power and control, and that is the colonial project. So maybe they're not there, period. But she did go looking for them and found things. And then what we did was we had this big public event with history students and the faculty of education professors and the public, where we acknowledged the materials that they had found and heard those stories. And they even made a film about that. My other example is my students and I went to Mackenzie House. Obviously, I like local stories. I'm taking my students out all the time. For those of you who are not from Toronto, William Lyon Mackenzie was our first mayor in 1834. But he was, sort of a bit rebellious and didn't spend very much time there. And yet here is this house that's named after him, and everything in it was about him. And I said, well, he wasn't here for very long, but his daughters, he had several daughters, and his mother and the women servants who were, well, they were there for years. Where are their stories? And in fact, they took that on as a challenge. They ended up gathering funding to obtain documents that they ended up having to get them from Scotland to bring those stories back to Mackenzie House and to recognize these gender more analyzing a museum where the narratives are all about white males who are in positions of power has to be challenged. I challenged it, and now it's a little bit more of a gendered story, looking at relationships as well. I find that more interesting myself, but I'm hopeful. And when I get extremely hopeful, it's when I see colonial institutions focused on Indigenous or racialized women and diverse genders in exhibitions that feature their stories and their material culture. And we all need to support those events. We need to come out to them. We need to help provide the funding for that, because some of them have that in their collections. And if they don't, they need to reach out to find those. And we need to share those. And I will add that there's still not a women's history museum in Canada, despite the many who have advocated for that.
Dawn, could I add a word?
Absolutely.
On the question of archives, I just wanted to, Rose, and all of you who are interested in archives, to know that I put into the Archives of Ontario, the building that's on the York University campus, the first selection of my archives, which really comprised a history of the second wave women's movement, in which I was involved for many years. And so it's there now, and I'm now in the midst of trying to put together the rest of the material. That was paper. I'm gathering video and film and photographs and that sort of thing. But they were very eager to have it, because they said, we realize we don't have a lot of women's history in our archives, and it's very important that we do that. So they were very eager to have it, and I think that's a good sign. And I know that I've received some communications from researchers who have used it, so I know that it's being used. And that was, as I say, 2018. So sorry to interrupt your program, but I just thought that you would be interested in that.
Oh, no, thank you. And Rose, both Rose and you, Linda, thank you for segueing us nicely right into our final closing words, comments that I'd like from everybody. Just some closing thoughts on, where are those areas of hope? Where are those areas of possibility? We've talked about those challenges, but if we can wrap our conversation up on those bright lights of hope and change makers. I mean, I was fangirling a little bit when you were talking about sitting around the kitchen with Audre Lorde. I was like, I can't even imagine such a thing. Just wow. But that would be my ultimate moment. We'll start with Adele. Do you have some areas of hope?
Ooh, Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated week to talk about areas of hope. I mean, not because they're not there, like they are always there. And I think one of the maybe one of the unanticipated benefits of dwelling in the past in your mind a lot is that we know that people have lived through difficult moments before, and have found ways to persist, and ways to um, cope, and ways to make change. And they've left records that we can turn to, and that we do turn to, and that we find inspiration and solace and understanding there. So I think that is it. The other thing that I'll say is students are really there for this work in a way that I'm not sure has always been. Well, I think it's probably has always been the case, but certainly there's sometimes kind of this idea that these are kind of ways of looking at the past that are kind of becoming out of vogue, and at least what I kind of feel like I experience, and I don't know if this is true for Carleen and Rose and yourself, Dawn, as well, but students that are really, really eager for these discussions and this information. And I think we're at kind of a critical kind of moment where knowledge needs to be kind of shared. And I am mainly like a historian of the 19th century, but I teach, all sorts of stuff. And one of the things that I come back to teaching a lot about is kind of histories of kind of the body and reproductive justice and injustice. And part of that is because the students really, really, really want to learn about this material. And it's material that for those of us that were kind of kicking around in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, we know in those ways, but people who are not around then do not necessarily know those stories and those histories. And we're at a moment where I think it's really, really crucial that we communicate those experiences and those histories to a group of people who didn't live through it firsthand. And resources like the Rise Up Archive is a really, really rich source to be able to do that.
Thank you so much, Adele. And Carleen, some thoughts on moments of hope?
Okay, I'm still gonna blend pieces because I
Absolutely.
that's okay. But
Go for it.
Well, I was maybe going to end with this, but maybe I'll start with it. I just want to echo what Adele is saying. I have often taught a class here called here at Trent called Queer Feminisms, and honestly, like I thought, oh my God, like I'm like a 50-year-old dyke. They're gonna be like, really? This is what I kind of imagine. Like they're gonna be all hip and cool and like on, I don't know, TikTok or I don't know, Blue Sky. They've already pretty switched to Blue Sky. Anyway, you know what I mean? But I was very nervous teaching that class because I was like, gosh, I'm apart from, and it was what you said. I mean, they just loved it. And it's almost hard to remember what's history, when it's in your life. Oh, well, like women's music, the sex wars, and they're like, what are you talking about? Oh, okay, let's see. And it's so exciting. Like they just love it. I mean, they love the class, and it doesn't matter if you're a boring village, whatever. They don't care. They don't care. Nobody's told them this stuff. They're so happy somebody's telling them this stuff. You're like, oh, that's amazing. Okay, and then just a couple other thoughts. One, I love Rose's intro with the lying on forums, and what our moms tell us about lying on forums, because coming from the US, I've been here like I'm half and half. I'm 26 years there, 26 years here. But when I just that was like part of my political consciousness, because in the US they constantly get you to write your ethnicity and race on forums. It's just a whole practice. And I get this form and it says, are you white, not of Hispanic origin? Are you Hispanic? Which, like, just, Chicanos hate the term Hispanic, but just that's what's on forms. And I'm like, I don't know what to say because and they didn't have anything mixed at that point because they couldn't imagine that. And then my mom's like, well, of course you're Mexican. And I'm like, really? Like Pendleton? It wasn't, they're not, that part of me. She's like, they don't, she's like, they think so poorly of us. Like you don't need to give white people credit for you. Give the Mexican people credit for you. And fair enough, because she's the one that really molded me, but it was a consciousness. Oh, what, like, I didn't even think about what that meant until a form. It's so interesting how forms do this to us. Or even, I remember the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan, and my dad told her, my dad announced the facts of the family, and the facts were that they voted for Anderson, and it was third party. And then my mom, a few years later, I didn't know. I didn't vote for Anderson. I'm like, oh, I voted for Carter. You did? Oh yeah. What's the point of arguing with? There's no point in having an argument, you know. And I present this as a challenge because these are all like, how do you research history when when I don't know, so many women do things without, like, apart from the forms. They're like, yeah, here's the forms, here's this, here's the family argument, not doing that. How do you get those the silences that you're both talking about, when we know that the women will on the side secretly tell you what actually happened? But so how do you do that? So anyway, so I'll just propose this now, like, as a little bit of a move, like, of what I'm doing with history. And again, I really, admire the precision. This is not the precision, okay? But this piece. I saw a couple of, again, my inspirations. Emma Bettis, a very important Chicana historian. She had a book called The Decolonial Imaginary, and I use that a lot in writing my dissertation about Latinas in Toronto. And she kind of allowed room for that. She's like, yeah, where do we make, how do we make, fighting the colonial history, how do we make a history in those silences? How do we do that? And then I also was, Linda Smith, like, how do we write history that's restoring spirit? So these were kind of my guides. And as a, kind of a creative writer, and also Emma Bettis is a historian and creative writer, like, she rewrote her own version of the Alamo. She's like, oh yeah. Says something like rewriting the Alamo or Blood Memory. She has a whole other version. So she gave me kind of a model of, like, you could study this and then make your own piece. And also the work of Isabel Millan, who came up with this notion of autofantasia, which is like autobiography and fantasy, which is like you're working on a historical fact, but then you're going to fill in some gaps with some things that you want, and maybe that you want for your mom or your grandma or those characters, So that's one way, that's one way of, like, I'm writing these histories now, but I'm giving sometimes some gifts to the women characters. Like, you need this one. You deserve this. You earned it. It's fun. It's fantasy. It's that autobiography and fantasy together. I don't know. Like, it's a different, it's a different kind of genre, but it's one where you can, I write a lot about the washes in LA. Well, I didn't even know that other people didn't grow up with washes, but it's one of the reasons I love working next to the river here, because I grew up with everything was concrete in LA. And they just got rid of all the water that would have maybe saved the place, And all of a sudden I could write about that, and I'm having people in the town I grew up in, oh, why are there waters? Like, you can put so many historical pieces and then also offer this kind of hope or story or imagination, and it's a blending. So that's something I'm working on that is really, I don't know, meaningful to me. And, maybe that's a path some of you might be interested in. Anyway.
Amazing. And actually, if we can ask you to put in the chat where people can access your latest short documentary that was released, where they can find it, to see some of that story. And Rose, a little more on ideas of hope and moving forward.
Well, I am always hopeful, despite the things that are happening. I realize that, and I teach this to my students, that state history has this powerful tool to shape public opinion and actions. And of course, we know that from the political attacks taking place on women, and gender discussions as indoctrination. But historically correct analysis about our past requires the inclusion of all citizens. And I have to say that I'm always motivated and feel positive being surrounded by teacher candidates who are the new teachers are going out because they understand that more than once people did in the past who were part of those small changes. But these students are really well informed and willing to take that on, I hope, although they will fight, they will find that they have a lot of resistance. And so change is taking place in terms of education, but I try to teach my students to go further. So, for example, we now, which is wonderful, have in our curriculum that we've accepted the topic of children being forced into residential schools. That's right across the curriculum, where it starts in social studies in the elementary years and then goes right up to the senior years. But we need to dig a little deeper now. I say to them that they need to speak about the rise of violence and the crisis of murdered Indigenous women and girls, for example. How do you do that in a classroom? Because that also has to be there. And it's great we've taken these steps, but we have to take more. So I've got two things going. As I said, the Framing Our Past 2.0, where we are creating all of these documents, and it's going to be a dedicated website. And these are teacher ready materials that are going to come up. So I can send you the link once that's done. And I also teach a public history course where I ask all my students as their major project to do a blueprint for change. So in that blueprint for change, which some of them actually make real change, they can address some of these issues that we've talked about today in institutions, in colonial structures, in education, in the public, and they can design something that would make a change in terms of creating greater equity and opportunities for diversity. And they do a fabulous job of that. So, I created that course so that I could be a part of that positive potential for change.
Amazing. And I think, when we're talking about these ideas of hope right now at this time where we're reminded how fragile rights for women are, how fragile rights for people of all genders are in this current society. I think about the fact that a few years ago, I remember with a group of young women, and they were asked if they were feminists, and they were all very like, oh, no, no. And they were kind of embarrassed or ashamed to say that they were feminists. Like, no, they're not. They don't need feminism anymore, because we were talking about whether there was going to be a third wave, whether they were like, no, it's not needed, And their ability to even say we don't need a third wave of feminism is because of that work of those women in the first and second wave who were willing to be hated, who were willing to be ridiculed, who were willing to put themselves out there. And that generation of young women saying like, no, no, we don't want to be labeled as ball busters. I'm not a man hater. And now more than ever, I see young women standing up and saying gender rights are important, realizing the fragility of that, realizing that we have to maintain this constant vigilance. We can't ever get complacent and feel like we've already achieved and we're good, or it's not that's not my fight kind of thing. So many young women just in the last months, and especially in this last week, are taking up that call to action and starting to express their voices in a way that they didn't feel they had to before. So shaking people up is good, and empowering our young women and hearing those voices. And I think events like tonight, more than ever, are getting that vision, that voice, and the importance of having those multiple perspectives. And as usual, I have taken up more than the time I was given. We are right at 6 o'clock. And so there's some really great comments in the chat. If people can look at some of these suggestions for things we can look at, I very much encourage you to check out the Country Wives, Tender Ties, Women in the Fur Trade by Sylvia Van Kirk. Amazing, amazing work. And, who knows, maybe we can start posting keep an eye on our social media for different suggestions that will be coming out on wonderful places where you can find women's voices. And I'm going to march myself over to Carlene's office tomorrow and steal that copy of that book that I desperately want to read now. And I will turn it back to Deborah. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for spending your evening with us.
This has been a terrific conversation, and I really want to thank Adele and Carlene and Rose, and especially you, Dawn, for keeping us so engaged and on track. And of course, I'm going to blow it by a few more thank yous that'll run us past 6, if you'll bear with me. But really, what also makes every single one of these webinars so interesting and fun is, as you mentioned, all the comments in the chat, the interactions that Linda and Rita and others have brought. I always feel so much better when I attend these events. And I hope all of you joining us know how much we appreciate your engagement and your interactions. There are so many ways that you can help us now. For example, Talia and Penny, who have been here and in part of the conversation, attended some of our events and then became board members. We certainly encourage you to think about that. Of course, all of these stories and the ones still to come, including Linda's, are only made possible through fundraising, which we are doing all on our own. So if you have the means, we certainly encourage you to consider making a donation to the Women's History Project through CREA so that you get your tax credit. So that's really important. But I also just want another quick thank you to Deborah and to Leah, who have been backstopping this whole event. And of course, to Ellen Beveridge, who has put this whole thing together and continues to be our coordinator of all good productions. So really appreciate that. And I also just wanted to put in one final plug. If you like this, you're going to love the next event on February 20th, which is about curating and gender. At the same time, 4:30 to 6. And I'm sure Ellen's already thought to put this in the chat, but just in case, the webinar is going to be talking about the challenges and processes of our changing understanding of women's history, taking the lens of places and tools now being used to share and showcase more gender history. We talked a lot about that tonight, but it's going to be taking it to the next step. How are we curating our history? How do we make sure that people don't have such a hard time finding the records that we need to continue to tell our stories? So please join us again next month. And thanks everybody for attending this evening. We really appreciate having you.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody. I wish you a wonderful evening and that you're walking away with this breathless and inspired as I am and ready to go out and face the world. Thank you, everybody.